So the quiz question today, we'll get to it, but is how do you think utilitarianism would approach the coronavirus pandemic? That's COVID. COVID is a coronavirus, right? Yes, no, maybe so.
There's multiple kinds of coronaviruses. It's like a family. But COVID is specific.
That's what I thought. Okay, so I did a terrible job last class, I thought, because I tried to introduce so many members of the milieu with the reference to the book The Magnificent Rebels and Goethe. Goethe is a study you could do on your own. Fantastic individual. Is also kind of a corrupt individual, by the way. I remember discovering, I have the complete works of Goethe at home, and I was reading through some of them, and I hit a poem, and I started reading it, and I realized he stole this completely from John Donne. So I realized he would, at that time, translating from English into German, no one else would catch him, right? So he published a lot of stuff that was really his translation of others without indicating, as far as I could see, that he was just translating somebody else's poem. Instead, he just published it. He became famous for that poem, which is essentially the poem of John Donne, 150 years earlier. So that's kind of interesting that you get away with stuff like that. But I feel bad that I didn't really do a good job introducing Hegel's master-servant situation. So I took the liberty of bringing this device. You've probably heard of them. In fact, I heard last night from John Stewart. No, not John Stewart. One of the other night people. The reading is coming back into the Z generation. Who's the Z generation?
It's kind of like a trend, kind of, at this point.
Yeah. Although they made fun of it, of course. You know, the person he had on the show that talked about reading War and Peace. Then when he opened it, it turned out that it was hollowed out, and inside it was her cell phone or smartphone. So it might be just a joke. I don't know. Well, it's not John Stewart. What the heck is his name? Colbert. Anybody watch Colbert? Nobody. Oh, no. He said he was out of touch, and if I'm just watching him and he's out of touch, we're both out of touch. I don't know. What do you guys do at night? That's probably totally wrong for me to ask. Robin wants to say.
Sleep.
Du bist schlafen? Warum? Das ist sehr schlecht. My wife came to bed last night at 5 o'clock a.m. That's just wrong, because I'm getting up in just a couple hours, and she's. However, let me read to you guys, because I felt so bad that I did such a terrible job with this. So this is, I could go look it up, but the last time I did that, I ended up stuck in the introduction, and I never got to the actual text. But here I am. This is the phenomenology of spirit. This is where self-consciousness comes into play. It arrives, so to speak. Remember, as a child, you don't have self-consciousness as he understands it initially. You have sense certainty, then you move into the terrible twos where you are able to imagine the opposite of things, so your imagination is beginning. But it's at the point where you become self-conscious, and that could be roughly around 2 years old or so, maybe a little older, theoretically, it's the year that you look in a mirror and you realize that that is you that you're looking at in the mirror, right? And we could even talk about this mirror test, not only with regard to people, but we could talk about it with regard to animals. So, for example, parakeets looking in a mirror, that, you know, we put these little mirrors with the bells and stuff in the cage for a parakeet. Parakeets look at the mirror and they keep trying to feed the birds that they see in the mirror. And so they dirty up their mirror by smacking, you know, chewed up seeds all over the mirror all week long. So of course, once a week at least, you have to clean off the mirror, because otherwise it's no longer effective. Right? If you have a parrot, on the other hand, and I had a Quaker parrot for a couple of years. She was a genius. She wasn't an Einstein. I don't know if you like the African Greys, and one of them was named Einstein and became quite famous. But my Quaker parrot, which we inherited, it was a used bird named Pico. And one of the oddest things about it is when I started walking around with it on my shoulder, I started to wheeze like an old man while I was walking. And I thought, but I'm not wheezing. It was the bird that was wheezing. It was the person that the bird had been with for many years, probably, had always wheezed while he was walking along. And so the bird picked up that habit and would wheeze, make the sound of a wheezing person. And so all of a sudden now I'm walking around with this parrot on my shoulder and I'm wheezing as I'm walking along. You could just hear me going. I think that's hilarious. But that bird never messed up its mirror, because when it looked at the mirror, it knew it wasn't some other bird. It knew it was itself. It passed the mirror test. So when you look at it, you recognize that it's you. What do you need in order to pass the mirror test? First, I would argue you need language. And you might say, well, wait a minute, great apes don't have language. Yes, they do. We all know that they have some kind of language, and they clearly understand themselves. Dolphins clearly see their reflection and know it's them, and they even have names. We've got people that study the language of dolphins and try to communicate with them and so on. To some effect, actually, right? Same thing with other mammals such as the orcas and the great whales and so on, have all this kind of thing. But people need, first off, a language, and you also need to have a concept of yourself, so that you have words that you apply to you, so that you can say things like I was trying to do in my ridiculous imaginary encounter, you know, as I was describing it, you know, the walking into the bar and meeting other people, and, you know, that's actually applies to any encounter where one consciousness meets another consciousness. That includes you yourself thinking about yourself, because that's why there's two of you in that encounter. So you're self-conscious. You are aware of yourself, right? So here's Hegel's description of how any such encounter works, right? Self-consciousness is in and for itself, right? So in itself is the subjective side that's having the experience, and the for itself is the things that you think are you, the concepts that you hold in language that you think of as yourself, right? Mikey, you know, I'm Mikey, you know, whatever, right? So self-consciousness is in and for itself, in and through being in and for itself for another self-consciousness. So in this situation, one self-consciousness is meeting another self-consciousness, right? That is, it is only as something acknowledged or recognized. A self-consciousness doesn't make, there's no such thing unless there's some recognition of that other self, right? The concept of this unity of self-consciousness, in its duplication, of the infinitude realizing itself in self-consciousness. This is funny because last night we were up in library, the main room up on the third floor, and we had a panel discussion. We had two visitors, veterinarians that were also teaching future veterinarians, and their main concern was the moral problems that veterinarians have, because they're not just dealing with the patients, the pets and things that people bring to them, they're also dealing with the owners. So they're not just one-on-one with the patient doing what the patient desires, they're stuck with a owner in between that may or may not want to pay for whatever they know that they could do for the health problem that the pet has, right? But what was neat about this was it was also on Zoom, and we're sitting there in this room with the screen that is the Zoom screen right behind them. And inside that screen, you could see the picture of them sitting at the table. And then inside that, you could see the screen. And inside that screen, you could see the picture of them sitting at the table. And inside that, you could see a picture of the screen. And inside that, you could see a picture of them sitting at the table. And I meant to get up real close to see how the infinitude of this continued on. I don't know how many the pixels would have been able to pick up, as it goes. But it was so neat seeing, and every time the head moved, you'd see the head move on all of the individuals in the infinitude of things. This is, and so you could do this with yourself with a double mirror. You could see yourself, and then it reflects and reflects and reflects ad infinitum, practically, right? This is exactly something that happens when you're thinking about yourself, because you could be thinking about yourself, as I am right now, where I'm thinking about myself. I'm trying to describe, what is that like when I'm thinking about myself? And notice, of course, you could do that still further, because as I'm thinking about myself, I realize that I'm trying to think about myself, thinking about myself, and so on, right? So you can end up with this kind of infinitude that can drive you crazy, absolutely. In fact, it might even be one of the explanations for individuals that have multiple personalities, right? What does that mean, right? Well, they have multiple selves that they think of as themselves, that they can act as that particular self. I'm, for example, right now acting like a teacher, or pretending to be a teacher, although precisely at this moment I'm thinking about myself and the facade of me trying to pretend that I'm a teacher. So I'm removed even from that particular aspect of myself by the reflection on my character as trying to act that way, etc., right? You could do this, right? You can play with yourself and think about yourself, thinking about yourself, thinking about yourself, etc. So this is where we get the word infinitude. The infinitude realizing itself in self-consciousness is a many-sided and many-sense complex, so that the moments of this complex, right, must both be held carefully apart and at the same time taken and understood in this differentiation as not distinct or always also in their opposed sense. So we can think about it as, well, what's the in itself experiencing as opposed to what the for itself is experiencing. But notice that my self-consciousness is both of these together, right? So you have different moments of what you're doing that you can think about. The double-sensedness of what is distinguished lies in the essence of self-consciousness, of being infinite or boundless. That is, immediately the contrary of the determination in which it is established. The laying apart of the concept of a spiritual unity in its duplication, presents to us the movement of acknowledging. So there's a movement in me thinking about myself, or me and you both talking to one another,